Hello everyone, welcome to our Egyptian online seminar group. First, compose of. Then if you have any questions, you can ask our speaker during her presentation or after her presentation. I have great pleasure of welcoming dear Professor Karen Nelson. Karen Nelson is a professor of accounting at Texas Christian University. She earned her Ph.D. from the University of Michigan and a bachelor degree from the University of Colorado. Professor Nelson served on the faculty at Stanford University and Rice University and as a visiting professor at the University of Michigan. Professor Nelson's research focused on financial reporting and disclosure issue. Her research is published in top-ranking journals, including the Accounting Review, Journal of Accounting Research, Journal of Accounting and Economics, and the Review of Accounting Studies. She is an editor of Accounting Horizon. Now we will start our seminar with dear Professor Karen Nelson.
Thank you so much for the very kind and generous invitation to present today, Mohammed, and also for the really lovely introduction. It's a very big pleasure and opportunity to present this paper here today. One of my co-authors is online with us, Patrick Hopkins, my colleague here at TCU. Our other co-author, Stephen Lush, who was a previous colleague of us at TCU, is at Kentucky now, and he is otherwise committed today, so he won't be joining and being able to offer his perspective on any of this. So once again, thank you. This is just a wonderful opportunity, and I think we all owe a debt of gratitude to Mohammed for taking the time to set up and for years running this international seminar. I think it's very innovative and is certainly contributing a lot to the academic community. So with that, I'll begin talking about our paper today. It has a rather long and perhaps unwieldy title, Sample Heterogeneity in Archival Accounting Research, Evidence from Pooling Knowledge and Traditional Firms. For those of you who aren't familiar, the slide here, the little figure in the background, that's the TCU mascot, which is our horned frog. And so he will be looking at us today as well. So in starting this project, my co-authors and I, we kind of stumbled upon this area of sample heterogeneity. Neither of us are really methodological researchers. Both Patrick and Stephen are tax researchers, whereas I am a researcher that does work in capital markets, disclosure, reporting issues. And so this was something that we wanted to work together. And we found this very interesting result, and then we just started digging into it further as we went along. And I think a part of our motivation for this, if we think about how, particularly in accounting, we do research, we're looking at, particularly these days with large data sets, easily available. Think back to how many papers that you've read that talk about, we provide large sample evidence, and the benefits of large sample evidence have really been played up. But while there are benefits, it does create potential heterogeneity problems if that sample has distinct differences. And so that's what we want to investigate, is what we believe is kind of some overlooked aspects of doing research on very large samples that maybe have some heterogeneity involved in them. And so just to kind of start with what problems or effects to be aware of when you have sample heterogeneity, while we think that, again, large sample evidence and large samples are good, Hassler and Thadewald talk about and present an analysis showing that pooling data to obtain the better estimates with more observations is actually not a valid procedure in general. So they're talking about potential coefficient bias that may arise by pooling heterogeneous subsamples of groups. Now, in their paper, their analysis, they give a short example of looking at the relation between height and body mass index for men and women. And we would expect those to be heterogeneous samples and to have a different relation between them. So if we think about what the coefficient estimate is that we're talking about, where does this bias come from? You know, our estimated beta, our coefficient, our slope coefficient has the covariance in the numerator. And so obviously, if you have two separate subsamples with two separate associations between the independent and dependent variable, then you are going to have some issues in terms of how that affects your coefficient estimate. One thing that our co-author team has received several comments on is that, well, obviously, if you're mixing two subsamples that have different associations, that's going to yield an estimate somewhere in the middle, right? So we think about the weighting of the sample size between subgroup A and subgroup B, that the coefficient estimate will be somewhere in the middle. And I think there's two issues with sort of that mindset, that approach, in that we don't really learn as much inferentially when we're just taking a coefficient between two subsamples and just looking at something in the middle, right? So there's inferential problems in that we are not really understanding how the data behaves when we're just accepting this sort of something in the middle attitude towards our coefficient estimate. But there's actually even more issues here, not just the covariance, the slope association, slope heterogeneity. With that slope heterogeneity, if you include, you know, the intercept, will basically pick up the mean effect of the two groups. And so while you are going to have inferential issues, but with the pooled coefficient, it's not going to lead to coefficient bias. But the other aspect that's more or has been overlooked to a much greater degree is the effect of the variance. And so the coefficient estimate is a function of both the covariance and the variance. And to the extent, as the quote from this paper talks about, if you have a different variance between your two subsamples, and I'm just going to talk about it in terms of two subsamples. Obviously, it could be extended to more subsamples. But if you have this different variance between your two subsamples, that is what could lead to the bias in the coefficient results. So the conclusion of their paper is that coefficient bias is going to occur when the subsamples have both the different expected associations, the different slope heterogeneity, but also the different variance. And so that variance becomes critical here in terms of we're not just talking about losing inferential ability by getting an average coefficient or a coefficient in the middle, we're getting biased coefficient estimates. Now, there is a way that we can deal with that coefficient bias, and this isn't discussed in the Hassler and Thadewal paper, but we could do weighted least squares regression. Not at all common, I think, in the accounting literature, at least, to do weighted least squares. The only examples I've really seen are where we're weighting by, you know, firm size. But that's not the problem here. Again, the problem is the weights with the variance. So we could weight the least squares regression with the inverse of the variance of the two sample groups. Again, that would solve the coefficient bias problem, but it wouldn't allow us to get good inferences on the behavior of the two groups. We would just have an unbiased coefficient estimate that is somewhere in the middle between the two groups. The other way that we could look at this is doing like a fully interacted model, or basically running separate regressions for the two different subsamples to address this bias. And that's, as we'll talk about more in a minute, that is kind of the direction that we're going down. The one thing that will not help you in this situation is fixed effects. And I know as a group of academics and literature, we become very enamored of our fixed effects structures. We put tons of fixed effects into everything, but those fixed effects are only going to control for time invariant characteristics that are going to affect the average level of the dependent variable between the two subgroups. So again, those are not going to take care of the coefficient bias issues that we have and that we want to address here. So we're not dinging fixed effects at all. We're just saying it doesn't address the particular problem that we are focusing on. So to kind of summarize this particular aspect of the first aspect of the effects of sample heterogeneity is to think about it that pooled coefficients are going to be biased, and they're not going to be just biased in some random way. They're going to be biased towards the subsample with the higher variance. So if we have the two groups, the higher variance subsample is going to be where the coefficient bias is towards, and it's also going to produce error rates that are greater than the specified test level. We've done some, in our paper, we have an online appendix or a separate appendix where we've done a simulation showing these results. And it's interesting that even if the subsample with the greater variance is a minority of our total observations, we don't have to have a large subsample with greater variance to have these effects play through. And so in our simulation, we look at it in terms of even if your subsample with the higher variance is only 10% of your pooled sample, you would still get these coefficient bias issues running through your analysis. Okay, so that is kind of issue one. Issue two is a related but issue that's gets more attention in the accounting literature, but it is intricately related or intertwined with this issue of coefficient bias. And that is how we identify outliers. And so we think about two subsamples, one with a greater subsample variance than the other. When we start to think about subsamples and variance, we start to think about outliers. And as researchers, we don't want to have outliers affecting our results or driving our results. I personally like this definition of an outlier in Hawkins, 1980. We all sort of know an outlier when we see it, if we plot the data, but I think it's a nice intuition that an outlier is an observation that deviates so much from other observations as to arouse suspicions that it was generated from a different mechanism. And so in accounting, and I would say finance, most economic related fields, what is this different mechanism? Oftentimes in accounting, what we'll be thinking about is the different mechanism where we have outlier is because there's some unique economic event that takes place that affects a particular firm or a small group of firms. And so in the Leone et al.'s analysis of outliers, they talk about it a lot in terms of, unusual, infrequent economic events. These could be things like impairment charges, gains or losses, restructurings, a whole sort of firm-specific if you will, one-off sort of unusual events, infrequent events. And we want to get those out of our analysis because they could cause inferential problems as well. But what we're arguing in this paper is that it's not necessarily the case that it will just be these infrequent or unusual economic events, but that the effects of these outliers could be more systematic. And what we mean by that is that the outliers may not be randomly distributed across subsamples within the pooled sample. So this goes back to our critical issue of variance in the sample. If we know we have one subsample that has higher variance, well, more of the outlier treatment procedures are likely to capture observations from that subsample. So Patrick put together this nice little example for us. If we have sort of two subsamples, we got our yellow one here and our blue one here. They have basically the same mean. So there's not slope heterogeneity issues. They have the same mean, but as you can see, different variances. And the yellow subgroup has a much wider variance. And so when we're thinking about applying our usual outlier methods, that yellow subgroup is going to probably be disproportionately identified in terms of having outliers. And those outliers will either be treated like in a Windsorizing setting, or discarded if it's truncation or one of our other methods of treating outliers. That's going to affect the composition of the pooled sample, but because they do have the same mean, generally, it probably won't bias our coefficients, the pooled coefficient estimate. Remember, we need sort of two factors here, the slope heterogeneity and also the variance. And so in fact, if we trim some of the yellow sample on both the left tail and the right tail, it's probably going to reduce some of the sample differences in terms of variance. But now let's take another example where our two subsamples actually have different means, they diverge. And in this case, what may end up happening as we apply outlier treatment methods to the pooled sample here, it could shift the subsample means and now end up in a potential bias in our pooled estimate. And so we have these two factors that we think combined together can create some issues in our analyses, and largely consequences or issues that have not really been looked at, with the exception of one particular setting. And so we think of in accounting, at least, and I think in finance as well, where would sample heterogeneity exist? Where do we have a different set of firms? Well, the one that always comes up, I mean, again, think of the papers you've read. What's in the sample selection? The first thing we say is we exclude financial service firms and utilities, right? Those are almost always excluded. It's just become second nature to us. And why? Because they're different. In fact, in my experience, I would say a lot of times we become too accepting of the argument of excluding these firms because they're different, because some settings, yes, they are going to be very different when you're dealing with differences, say in accruals or cash flows. We do expect them to be different. In other settings, maybe not, but we exclude them because of their heterogeneity. And we do that all the time. And then there's whole other sets of literature that examine them separately. So everyone else outside of financial service and utilities is all basically at this point thrown in the pool, right? Everyone else is pooled together and we run analyses on that pool sample. But within that remaining pool sample, we're going to have knowledge firms built on intellectual capital and traditional firms. And these are just pooled together, and we haven't really thought about the effects of doing this type of pooling on our results. And so if we think about, what the two sectors are based on, our traditional sector, they're very capital intensive, physical inputs, established practices, as opposed to the knowledge sector based on intellectual capabilities, intangibles, commercializing technological or scientific advances. So a very different production function, a very different output function. There are obviously going to be some big differences between these types of firms. And so our overall research objective in this paper is, from the methodological side, we want to examine the effect of sample heterogeneity on research inferences. And we think this is an important issue that, at least in accounting, has not gotten much attention. Oftentimes people will, when they read their paper, they'll say, oh, this is intuitive. Of course, this is the case. But if it was the case and it was intuitive, everyone would be looking at these issues already. And they're just not in the literature generally taking that perspective. So overall research objective to examine coefficient bias and outlier identification is two interrelated issues for our heterogeneous samples. To make it a little bit more concrete, what we're looking at again is our traditional and knowledge sectors pooled into the same sample and how that might affect research inferences. And so let me just be clear, we're not trying to build up evidence that traditional and knowledge sectors are different, that they are heterogeneous. We're relying on evidence from past research by and large that says that they do have, the knowledge sector, very unique, often extreme financial characteristics. So if we're thinking about where's the logical place to start with this analysis? This is a very logical split into two subsamples based on some of the prior research. There's also been an increasing prevalence of the knowledge-based firms in the economy. Now, that's interesting. It makes it more relevant for a lot of people in this time period. And it could be then an effect, if we look at over time, that these effects are transitioning from a more homogeneous traditional sample in the early period to a more heterogeneous subsamples of traditional and knowledge sectors. But again, remember, you don't need to have a large subsample with the higher variance to actually have these effects. And so it's that the increasing prevalence in some cases is more just for the relevance of this question as much as the actual effects on the results. And so our objective per se is not to provide new evidence on these differences. We're using that as our baseline to understand how they could go affect research where people don't pay attention to those differences. There's probably a few additional pieces of information that we provide in doing our analysis about what the differences are between the two sectors, but that's not the main focus of our paper. And so we're going to look at this. We need to have some empirical settings where we can examine these issues. And so we're looking at 3 empirical settings to make sure that it's kind of consistent across areas. We're looking at earnings persistence and the persistence in particular of profits relative to losses, the association between earnings and equity values, and the association between earnings and cash flows. So these are 3 literatures that are all fairly developed that have looked at these issues. So that is our research question. Let's just talk a little bit about the research that has been looking at the knowledge sector and see how that differs from what we want to do in this paper. So some of the earliest research trying to look at having these knowledge firms, kind of these new sets of firms, the research question is broadly whether the financial reporting system, whether accounting is going to provide the information that investors need in this increasingly intangibles intensive economy. So some of the earliest research on this, going back to the Collins et al. Paper in 1997, very value relevant focus. So looking at the value relevance of earnings, excuse me, looking at the value relevance of earnings supplemented by other information, book values, other financial statement line items. And you can see that this research, it started in 1997, around the time that we started to have an increase in high-tech companies. So it became a very salient issue and salient question, but it's continued all the way up to a recent paper published by Barth et al. In 2023, where they look at a lot of different financial statement items and conclude that, in fact, when you take all of the financial information together, there is not an issue with the GAAP financial statements, the financial reporting system not providing the information that is needed. Now, related to that, there's I would say, a subset of that literature that in particular focuses on value relevance of loss firms, because most of these intangible intensive firms are going to be loss firms because of the internally generated intangibles that they have. And so, citing a few papers here, again, a long stream of research up to most recently in the RAST conference, the Gu et al. Paper that looks at loss firms in particular and the effect of the internally generated intangibles on the value relevance. And then more generally, there's a series of papers that look at other properties of earnings, not value relevance per se, but other properties such as revenue expense matching, earnings volatility. I think one of these papers, actually I think it was the Daroni, looks at some of the persistent stuff that overlaps with what we're doing. But in our case, what we want to look at, one more set of research here maybe before we get to that, is the next generation sort of this financial relevance, value relevance literature is saying, can we improve the information that's being provided by capitalizing internally generated intangibles? And I know Anoop was on a few weeks ago or a while ago on this seminar series talking about how you can capitalize internally generated intangibles. Does that provide better information to users if we had, in essence, a different financial reporting model than the one that we have? And that also is the Gu et al. Paper in the RAST conference recently was looking at, if you capitalize that, do you get better information? Now, interestingly, in this research, although everyone seems to say, well, of course, financial knowledge and traditional sector firms are different, we all know that, the evidence itself is actually conflicting. All of these papers that I mentioned, including a bunch of others, there's conflicting evidence regarding whether there has been a decline in value relevance of earnings or changes in other earnings properties. And if so, is that decline associated with intangible intensive industries? So it is an open question to some degree. Now, we're not saying that that's a fault of this literature, because what literature stream doesn't have conflicting evidence, right? That's just a process of doing research. There will be some conflicting evidence. What we maybe question is whether some of this is because of these bias issues and how different research choices, research design choices may have affected some of these studies. And in that regard, one thing that is very interesting to us is that these studies, while they are looking at the differences between technology or knowledge firms and traditional firms, the evidence is based on pooled samples of firms in models, and with the exception of this Core et al. Paper, pooled outlier identification. So while we're saying that we want to investigate these different sectors of the economy, still a lot of this evidence is coming from pooled results, particularly pooled outlier identification. Think again of the 2 bell curve example that I talked about earlier, but also based on pooled samples in the regression. So taking, say, market value on the left-hand side and including a intangible intensive proxy on the right-hand side, or R&D. So we're just pooling all of the firms in there and not thinking about these differences between the samples, and that may lead to spurious inferences, which is what we document in some of our findings. But I do want to emphasize what's important here is that what our focus is on this paper, and I think we probably need to focus some more on the write-up in the paper to make this clear, is that we're not looking at our analysis as another paper in this line of research related to the knowledge sector. What we want to talk about in this paper is, most accounting research is not in that literature. There's a vast amount of accounting research that has ostensibly nothing to do with the knowledge sector versus the traditional sector. But these issues may still affect that research. So all research that pools these two sectors is potentially affected by these issues. So it's kind of a fine point here. We're not examining the unique aspects of the knowledge sector. What we want to say is that in other research that has other research objectives, pooling these two sectors without looking at it more deeply may lead to inferential issues. Okay, so one question then is, well, how do we define these two sectors? We use the Global Industry Classification, or GICS codes, which some research says is superior to other classification systems. We define a knowledge sector as those sectors, GICS sectors, that have both a median R&D and a median intangible intensity greater than the respective means of the pooled sample. So again, we're looking for those extreme firms with a lot of intangible intensity. And those sectors, GIS sectors, are healthcare, information technology, and communication services. So even though we didn't define them just based on the sector title, we looked at the characteristics of the sector. It comes out the way you would expect it to, that healthcare, IT, and communication services are the ones that have are more likely to be the knowledge sectors, a lot of R&D, a lot of intangibles, unrecognized intangibles. And as you can see from the data down here, the results kind of fall the way we would want to, the split. We have in the knowledge sector much higher, significantly higher R&D and intangibles relative to what we'd see in the traditional sector. Now, obviously, knowledge-based investment, knowledge-based activity, economic activity is occurring across all sectors now, but we're still trying to make a distinguishing fact between these two subsamples. So if we look at sort of the firms across time, this is kind of interesting in that this includes our financial and our utilities. We don't include those later on in the analysis, but we do want to see kind of over time since the beginning of our sample in 1980 until the end of our sample in 2019, kind of what the trend has been. Utilities, you know, is pretty flat and even declining somewhat in terms of the number of firms. We just don't see growth in that area at all. It's very stable. In the early time period, the first decade, 80s, dominated by our traditional sectors, consumer and manufacturer. In the 90s, interestingly, of course, technology sector increased. That's our blue line here. This was the growth up through, you know, the end of the right before the internet bubble here, a huge growth in technology, but also growth in the yellow line in financials as quite a bit. In the 2000s, everything, all sectors started to decline. There's prior research, Deutsch et al. That kind of looks at these are firms that are either going private or being bought out, but there is a lot fewer publicly traded firms than we had previously. And then in the 2010s, we see more the green line, the rise of the healthcare sector. And I think that has not been as upfront or talked about with a lot of folks, because when we talk about knowledge firms, oftentimes it is technology. And there was a whole series of research around the 2000s trying to look at, you know, valuation of technology firms, the eyeballs have it, that kind of stuff. But now it's really sort of getting into the healthcare sector. If we break out these knowledge sectors, these knowledge industry groups, so these are the knowledge sectors, but now they're into their more finely described industry groups. What we see, of course, is the pattern where we have high tech, semiconductors, hardware and equipment increasing up here. Everyone's decreasing, but the real standout again here, the red line, is this increase in the biotech industry. So since 2010, basically, the biotech pharma has really taken over as being the most prevalent knowledge industry group. And this result is consistent with some work by another co-author of Petrick's and I, Josh White, and his co-author, Lewis, I don't know his first name, but that since the Jobs Act, 30% of all IPO offering volume has been in biotech. So the Jobs Act basically decreased the disclosure requirements. So a lot of these biotech firms were going public earlier, and a lot more of them were going public. So that was that's a new trend I don't think has been documented quite as much in the literature. Okay, so getting back to our two sectors, the traditional and knowledge, these are the variables we use in our analysis primarily, the variables that are used in a lot of analyses. And what we can see is that, as expected, the knowledge sector just has significantly lower earnings, cash flows, more likely to have a loss, lower accruals. The one difference is they have much higher market value of equity than the traditional sector. So what this is telling us is that, yes, there's a difference in the means across the two. But again, if the variances were the same, that would just be averaged out and taken care of by the intercept term. What's really has not been the focus of this research as much on the knowledge sector is the high variance in this sector. So it's not only that we have different means, medians, we have a much higher variance of all of these typical financial accounting variables, market value variables, just a lot of variance. So as we are setting up our analysis, it does seem to have the characteristics we would think of. It has different means, at different potential slope heterogeneity, as well as this high variance component. Okay, so let's get into the actual analysis. We kind of just set up the background there. What we want to look at now is our three settings, starting with the first, persistence of profit versus losses. And pretty much anyone who's gone through a doctoral program, read the literature, you will always hear this very well accepted finding, is that losses are less persistent than profits. The idea being that, they're more transitory. Firms can't stay in business when you have losses. They'll have to adapt or go out of business. Not to pick on this Lawrence Sloan and Son paper. Everyone, this was in the literature. They start their paper looking at this issue of persistence with this quote, the very first sentence in their paper: "It has long been established that losses are less persistent than profits." And that was in 2018, so not that long ago. So if we look at this, though, again, what are the characteristics of losses? And so first of all, they have twice the variance of the profits in the sample. So no matter which sector you're in, there's just twice the variance. So there's a lot of variance in loss firms. They are much more prevalent, of course, in the knowledge sector than in the traditional sector. So this graph is just showing you the percentage of each sector that is loss firms. Again, consumer and manufacturer, 20-30%, very stable over time. We see this spike around the 2000s with the loss firms for technology, and then just this really big increase with our healthcare firms over time in the number or percentage of losses in that sector. What else is interesting about these loss firms is over time, it has not become sort of a death knell. If you have losses for a few years, then you are going to have to adapt, or you'll go bankrupt. Is that the firms can operate for much longer time period, much more consecutive years of losses, and this is particularly in the knowledge sector. And so these are two heat maps of the knowledge sector and the traditional sector. As you go to the top and you get to the more red colors, the higher heat, those are the longer loss strings. So year after year after year after year of losses, up to 31 years straight of losses. We see that in both sectors, but much more pronounced in the knowledge sector. So there's a lot of reason to believe here that this notion that losses are less persistent than profits doesn't operate anymore. And so we run a very basic persistence model, but we run it both pooled and by sector. And we expect that estimating persistence for the pooled sample, based on our discussion earlier of the concerns about pooling heterogeneous subsamples, is going to bias the coefficient in a predictable direction towards the higher variance loss subsample. And again, loss is associated with the knowledge sector, so we're going to be biasing this coefficient towards the knowledge sector. And we're going to estimate this model, not just pooled and by sector, but we want to see the effect of different alternative outlier methods that are being used. The first one, Windsorizing by years, I would think is by far the most popular in accounting research, at least based on Leone et al.'s analysis of the methods used. Obviously, Windsorizing is just resetting values at the extreme. We're not truncating any information or observations. Cook's distance and influence diagnostic, which we don't see very much in the literature anymore, but it used to be more popular, I think, like when I was a PhD student. We, in this paper, are introducing a new idea behind Windsorizing, particular because of sample heterogeneity. And that is not just Windsorized by year, but Windsorized by sector year. So we're not going to be taking just the extreme that are in our more extreme variance subsample, but we're going to allow the economic characteristics of the two heterogeneous subsamples to play out when we are trimming or Windsorizing those samples. And then the final one, robust regression, another influence diagnostic. This is analyzed in a lot of depth in the Leone et al. Paper. This doesn't reset observations. It doesn't truncate observations. It downweights observations that it determines our outliers. And so any down-weighted to 0 observation, we're saying is an outlier. And that's the common sort of analysis way to do this. So yes, the observation is still in there, but it receives a weight of 0 in the analysis. So effectively is not affecting the regression. And so we start by running a pooled analysis like we've seen in all the prior studies. This first page shows the first 2 outlier methods. We do see a higher persistence for profits, the earn variable, than losses in most cases. But for Windsorizing by year, we do see this interesting pattern that in the mid-90s, losses overall pooled became more persistent than profits. And honestly, this regression is kind of the first one that we ran that led us down this path of, wait, that's not what we learned in our doctoral programs. Losses aren't more persistent than profits. What's going on here? If we look at the Cook's distance, we also see some convergence, although it doesn't tend to switch inferences like Windsorizing by year. When we Windsorize by sector year, we do see a little bit of indication that it's converging in the later time period. And finally, robust regression is we still see this notion of convergence. But what we do notice across all these outlier methods in the pooled sample, where we're pooling the heterogeneous sample, is that the percentage of outliers in the robust regression is very aggressive in identifying outliers. And so up to about 10% of all observations are being downweighted to 0 to say that these observations are outliers. We do see a very high R² as a result of that. And it is the best fitting model, with the Windsorizing by sector year being the second best fitting model. But we're tossing a lot of stuff out, 10% of the observations. So like pictures here, we look at our changes here in the effect on the outlier methods. And I see some stuff popping up in the chat. I think my co-author Patrick is kind of running the chat right now and taking care of responding those, and we'll get to open discussion here in just a second. But if we plot the raw data of earnings on next year earnings, the persistence, and then we're doing traditional is the blue and knowledge is the orange, we see that's very, in the raw data, pretty tightly clustered in the traditional, but a lot more variance in this relationship in the knowledge. When we do the Windsorizing by year, pretty much the same inference. What's interesting when you do the Windsorizing by year, we kind of get these lines here, these grouping or bands in the data, because each year we are Windsorizing the most variable samples with the data. So I don't think this is something that's really been documented in the literature by year. When we Windsorize by year, we're kind of doing a little bit of weird stuff to the data. Cook's distance, not that big of a change, again, because they don't throw out too many outliers. Windsorizing by sector here, we're seeing it come together a little bit. Again, the adjusted R² here. But this is the one that we really wanted to look at here. This is our robust regression. With my co-authors and I call this the robust regression rocket. Basically, if you are not on the regression line, you are not in there, right? It is tossing out that 10% of observations that being tossed out is quite a bit of the data. Anything that's not on the regression line, this last chart is showing everything that's being tossed out and how we're basically just clearing the path for that very strong regression line. And I know I want to just try and finish up in the next 5 minutes or so, at 7 minutes. But with this alternative methods of the outliers, this robust regression, yes, it's throwing out 10%. The other question is it throwing out sort of an even 10% across all of the sectors? And what we see is that no, it is not. For consumer and manufacturer for the 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, we don't see a lot of outliers identified in those samples. We see a lot more in technology and healthcare. And in particular, by the time you get to 2010s, you are throwing out a full 25% of your healthcare observations. The most populated sector you're throwing out 25% of them because they don't behave like because of their high variance, they're considered to be outliers. But they're healthcare firms. They're not necessarily having a high variance relative to their sector. So we run some regressions now where we split by traditional and knowledge, not a pooled regression, but the split regression. And what we see here is that the data really sort of comes together at this point when we account for that sample heterogeneity. In the traditional sector, no matter which method you use, losses are less persistent than profits, right? So that's kind of our traditional understanding. In the knowledge sector, around 90s, 2000s, in all four methods, we end up with losses becoming more persistent than profits. That inference is lost in our pooled analysis. And again, it doesn't matter which regression or outlier method you're using, we still have a pretty high percentage of outliers in the robust regression, but notice that it's not just in the knowledge sector, it's also in the traditional sector. Given the time that we have, I'm not going to go through sort of the coefficient bias issues, but if we were to go back to the pooled analysis, if we have a profit coefficient in the traditional and knowledge, we would again expect some weighting, something in between in the pooled analysis. And in fact, the pool coefficient was 0.692 for the pooled time series, where it's 0.596, 0.777. It is, as we talk about in the paper, biased towards the knowledge sector. It's not just looking at the relative proportion of firms in the sample. There is a bias towards the knowledge sector, both in terms of the profit and the loss coefficient. In fact, the loss coefficient is almost as close in the pooled sample as the overall loss coefficient in the knowledge sample. So there is a large bias in that coefficient. Okay, let me, again, these are just a couple of graphs that show that in the traditional sector, all of the losses, no matter which method over time, losses are less persistent than profits. And then in the knowledge sector, we see this change over time. Again, robust regression is a little bit different in that it starts to more mirror the higher persistence of the loss firms. So the two solid lines are moving together. We looked at the data, and basically that's because if a lot of the firms are switching between a loss one year and profit the next year, vice versa, robust regression is throwing those out. But there's no reason necessarily to think that those are outliers. It's just something that creates a negative coefficient, which robust regression says is off the regression line, so they get tossed out. So just to kind of summarize those results real quick, pooled estimation does result in some biased results. When we do it at estimating by sector, we're finding that the results kind of, if you will, settle down. They're much more consistent no matter how we're running those. Losses are less persistent than profits in the traditional sector in all 4 decades, but they become more persistent over time in the knowledge sector. And then finally, the common outlier methods are disproportionately targeting our knowledge firms. And so robust regression is in particular aggressive, and there is then a question cost-benefit consideration of getting that high model fit, that robust regression rocket, versus having a non-representative sample. So if you're trying to make conclusions and draw inferences, you don't really have a representative sample. So that's why we propose using this Windsorizing by sector year in order to maintain that relative sector contribution to the composition of the sample. All right, the rest of our 2 remaining settings I'm going to go over much more quickly because they just basically are showing different attributes of the same results. If we look at earnings and equity values, this is a graph in the Berkshire-Underchev TAR paper from 1997, where they're looking at this convex model where equity values are an increasing convex function of earnings. And this was a very highly cited paper. They talk about this predicted convexity is apparent even at the firm level for, and this is why I highlighted this comprehensive sample drawn from potentially heterogeneous set of industries, and time periods. Now, their time period is 76 to 94, so it is on the earlier end of things, but they're saying this is a very similar result, predicted convexity, no matter kind of who you throw into that. It is important to notice that in their analysis, they're truncating 3%, tossing out 3% top and bottom of earnings and 3% of market value. And they also require a positive book value, because without the positive book value, you're not going to have this setting where you can run the regression of earnings over book value. But again, most of the firms that have negative book values that are being tossed out here are your knowledge firms. So when we rerun this analysis, this is from the 1980s, separating again our traditional and knowledge, we see a very tightly clustered group of results for the traditional sector and more variance in the orange as we go to the knowledge sector. Now, this box we put in here to show that this is basically all of the observations that we have in our sample are confined within this relative space. Now, as we go to the 1990s, we see that traditional maintains its convex relation, but a lot of the knowledge firms are venturing out of the box, where we have a lot more knowledge firms up here that are high market value for lower amount of earnings, so very high market value during that time period. In the 2000s, we see it come back a little bit, but we see bigger loss firms for the orange knowledge sector, still having equal amount of equity valuation. And finally, in the 2010s, we see even more firms venturing outside of that box, just the loss firms primarily, over into much more extreme negative earnings, but still market values. So we run piecewise regressions. Let me just kind of skip to, again, a visual representation of these results. Basically, what we find is that the convex relation, it's very, when we run it in two separate subsectors, or the subsamples, in the traditional sample, it is very much the convexity, the difference between the high versus low, is very stable. So we have the convexity going on over this time period without much change. But for the knowledge sector, it has lost to a large degree a lot of the convexity, in that it's become much more dispersed and just flattened out like that. So the explanatory power is declining in the knowledge sector as that relation becomes much more dispersed. And then finally, real quick, the third aspect of the paper is looking at the accruals cash flow relation, which generally, since DeChow's thesis paper published in 1994, finds that accruals and cash flows are negatively associated, although recent evidence suggests that has weakened considerably. So if we, again, look at our pooled analysis, we do see some of this idea that it is a less negative, even going to positive over time. So our pooled evidence is basically consistent with that. But when we break it again into our two sectors, we find that traditional still has a negative relation. It's declining a little bit over time, but it is still negative in each decade. It's the knowledge sector where it is becoming less negative and even positive. When we do a piecewise regression again, we see that these differences are largely being driven by this correlation between negative cash flows and accruals and across the two. So summarizing that evidence, there's an overall negative relation in the traditional sector, but not in the knowledge sector. So again, pooling these sectors is not giving us a full picture of what is going on. And so we think in all three of our settings, we have provided important evidence of the effects of pooling these very different heterogeneous samples. We did run this classifying SIC codes using SIC codes following GU. We've received a couple of comments consistently that all we're picking up is a life cycle effect, that early stage firms are more likely to have prolonged periods of losses, That's particularly in the knowledge sector, so you're just picking up knowledge or life cycle results. Now, I will say if that is the argument, then that argument would apply equally to the literature I talked about at the beginning that looks at the value relevance of knowledge versus traditional firms, that result is also a life cycle stage result. But we did do just a first preliminary, I say Patrick, the partition by both sector and age in 5-year groupings, 1 to 5, 6 to 10, etc. And we do in our persistence analysis still find controlling for age groupings that losses are less persistent in the traditional sector in the 1 to 5, the 6 to 10, etc., but are more persistent in that same age grouping in the knowledge sector. So we do not believe that this is a life cycle story. Okay, so just to wrap up real quick, our first contribution, we're looking at the issues of pooling heterogeneous subsamples, particularly this idea of knowledge and traditional firms, and then the results that could arise from that: coefficient bias, poorly specified tests, over-identification of the knowledge sector in our outlier treatment procedures. Taking that to the 3 settings, we believe we're providing new evidence that helps to reconcile some of the prior evidence where there may be some inconsistencies, but also saying if we look at this in a different way, controlling for these differences, what we've had as widely accepted beliefs in pooled samples doesn't hold. Particularly 3 results: losses are more persistent than profits in the knowledge sector since the 2000s. The equity earnings relation is less convex, and that there's an overall positive relation between accruals and cash flows. So 3 very different results than we have traditionally thought of in the literature. Future research can consider how this knowledge traditional split may affect other research questions. For example, bankruptcy and fraud prediction models. You think about the variables that go into those prediction models. There are a lot of the variables we looked at here. So are we not, by taking into account the differences between the groups, are we not doing a good job there? Perhaps executive compensation, looking at like pay for performance sensitivities. We also think that future research should consider this approach of Windsorizing by sector year, but definitely examining the sensitivity and generalizability of different outlier methods, in particular looking at if you are disproportionately affecting a certain segment of the population. We could look at other sources of sample heterogeneity beyond the split between traditional and knowledge firms. That's just one way to look at this. And then carefully consider the underlying variables that are going into your analysis. So kind of almost made it to the end in my time frame. I can see we've had a very active chat, but we'll just sort of, I guess, open it up for questions at this point.
Yeah, thank you very much, dear Professor Karen, for your contribution and your effort. It is an excellent presentation. Thank you very much. Now, if anyone have any question, you can open your mic and ask your question. Professor James Olson, you have any question?
I think it would be, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I think it would be very, very useful if you indicated that your paper is dealing with methodology, and then you add on, here are the kinds of papers with citations that may well arrive at the incorrect conclusions because they do not recognize the points you're making.
Mm-hmm.
You can always do more. You can always complain, and there's misspecification and so forth. But the real issue at hand, those people who actually read journal articles in order to infer how the world actually works, worry about that the conclusions are unwarranted or not properly backed up and even correct. You have a methodology papers. you should point in the direction early on. Here are the kinds of papers that we worry about. They arrive at incorrect conclusions potentially. Here's why they potentially arrive at conclusions. Now we're going to check into the methodology. That would really, really help to motivate your paper. Am I clear?
Yes, no, you are. And I think it is really important because we have had trouble getting our message across. Some people view it as a methodology paper. Some people view it as a knowledge sector paper. And so we need to really think about how we're writing it
Yeah,
up.
I mean, it's a matter of motivating the listener or the reader. Another
Yeah.
question that pops up, of course, is that OLS has a very, very long history. And part of this history is that it really has no merits. It's very, very easy to arrive at incorrect conclusions if you use OLS. The literature has suggested that there's much to be accomplished by not doing OLS. So you should give some indication as to what else could we do to avoid the problems we're concerned about. And part of the answer to that question, in my mind at least, should be don't do OLS. My final point pertains to the fact that very, very few papers ever care about the magnitudes of the estimated coefficients. They care about the sign.
Right.
Am I crystal clear? There are
Yeah,
very,
yeah.
very few people that care about the, if the magnitude is 0.1 or 0.10 or whatever have you. They simply do not care. No papers do that, almost none. And therefore, the issue surrounds really what is the sign of the estimated coefficients. So if you're focusing on the magnitude of the estimated coefficient, then you should give illustrations of papers that focus on the magnitude of the coefficient that goes beyond the sign.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I don't know if we should be doing that, but we do focus more on the sign than the magnitude. I think where the magnitude
Yeah, but
comes
that's
in.
consistent with the literature. So again, if you want to tie it in
Yeah.
with what the literature is all about, the literature focuses on the sign in general. I'm not talking so much about intangible versus non-intangibles and whatever have you.
Yeah.
Okay.
I
And
think where the
finally,
focus in magnitude may come in is, claims that it's not economically meaningful. So there's
yeah,
where the
but don't,
magnitude.
may I suggest don't go down that route. People laugh. You know,
Okay.
all papers always find that you have economic significance. And that's kind of entertainment. It's sort of a little bit like focusing on robustness test. We always work they out. Focus on the weaknesses of the literature.
Okay.
Start out, here are the weaknesses of the literature. Potential incorrect conclusions should be important. So focus on the potentially incorrect conclusion or non-supported conclusions. Then you move on and say, here are the issues that are lurking in the background. Now my task is to develop hypothesis and check up how this actually plays out. Do we have a problem because of heterogeneity? And then you tie it back here are the kinds of papers that you have to be really concerned about. Conclusions may simply be incorrect.
And I think again, part of it is incorrect in more recent periods than in a lot of these
Well,
conclusions
that
that
may
go
be,
back to
yeah.
the persistence
Yeah.
argument. So much has been investigated that it becomes like in the quote I gave you on the slide, that it's well accepted that losses are less persistent than profits, and we just think that and we move forward with that rather than re-examining, has that result
Yeah, I mean,
changed? And was that result derived inappropriately because
again,
of
I come
methodology?
back to the very simple observations. The starting point ought to be, are there papers floating around arriving at unsubstantiated or even incorrect conclusions? If that's true, then the readers want to know which papers are probably likely to be candidates and how would we arrive at the correct conclusion.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the problems we face in general. I mean, you know as well as I do that papers are really not read from a point of view of correct conclusions. You know, this is what we do to publish. What I'm saying is that there are interesting questions lurking out there, and there are people who think that certain papers arrived at incorrect conclusions. There are people. So then the question is, do you guys who write this paper and do this research, have you been motivated by that there are papers out there which seem to arrive at dubious conclusions? Is that your motivation?
I would say yes, broadly speaking, that we
Yeah,
do
but
want
please
to point
tell us.
out.
Please tell us
Yeah,
about that.
yeah. And
Please
I
tell
think
us
the way
about
we've
that.
kind of done it is we've put that at the end more, that after we do the setup, then we look at these three settings where there are some incorrect conclusions, if you
Yeah, I
will.
mean, that's sort of the heart of the matter. In my mind, now, if you're not trying to tell people what to do, and that's fine too, but it should be crystal clear up front.
Yeah.
In my mind, of course, for what it's
No,
worth.
I appreciate that. And I'll just say something to off topic here. When I was a doctoral student at Michigan, Jim, you came to Michigan for a week-long or several days seminars with the doctoral students and the faculty. So you were one of my first faculty that I was really remembering learning from in the first few years of my doctoral program. It was a summer camp. Anyway, I just remember that.
Oh, yeah. I hate to say this, but you look much younger.
Oh, well, thank you. But
I'm
no,
serious.
I remember that quite clearly. The great Jim Olson came to visit us as doctoral students. So, yeah.
Well, anyhow, so that's
Thank
comes
you.
to free. Yeah.
Thank you.
Are there another question? If anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. Thank you very much, dear Professor Karen Nelson, for your contribution and your effort. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone joined to us today. And thank you very much for taking the time to present to us today. It's been appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I hope to see you soon in Egypt. You are very welcome.
That would be lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone who took time out of their Friday morning, afternoon, evening, wherever it is in your time zone to participate in this workshop. I very much appreciate it. And if you have any other questions that come up as you mull over what we talked about today, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or either of my co-authors. We would love to hear from you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.